It's not about how hard you hit the ground, but how high you bounce back after the fall. Join us for the most incredible stories of resilience and the undeniable power of the human rebound. Hit subscribe now and stay inspired by the strength of the spirit.
No, they never knew that the man they called an embarrassment would become the only reason I believed in love at all. The last time my father looked me in the eye, he said I was throwing away everything our family had built. 3 generations of attorneys. A name that meant something in this city, for a man who got his hands dirty for a living. I was 21 years old. I had never been more certain of anything in my life. My father, Richard Calloway, was a senior partner at Calloway & Merritt, one of the most respected law firms in Houston. He had his name on the building, literally, carved in granite above the front entrance, right next to a man who had been dead for 40 years. My mother, Diane, managed their social calendar like it was a full-time job, because for her, it was. Every dinner, every charity gala, every Sunday morning at First Methodist, all of it was curated to protect the family image. I grew up understanding that our last name was not just a name, it was a brand. And brands required maintenance. I met my husband at 20. I was finishing my junior year at University of Texas Austin, studying communications, which my father already considered a soft compromise from law school. My husband was working a summer job at a construction site 2 blocks from my apartment. His name was Marcus Webb. He was 23, had a 2-year trade certification, and was the best welder the foreman had seen in a decade. He had calluses on both hands and the most straightforward, honest eyes I had ever looked into. Our first conversation lasted 4 hours. We sat on the tailgate of his truck in the parking lot of a Whataburger and talked about everything. His plans to start his own fabrication shop someday, my complicated feelings about a career path I had chosen to please other people, the way big dreams get slowly sanded down by the people who are supposed to want the best for you. I drove home at 2 in the morning and sat in my car for 20 minutes before going inside, just to hold on to the feeling a little longer. We dated for 7 months before I brought him home. I should have prepared better. I told myself my parents would see what I saw. Someone grounded, ambitious in a different way, genuinely kind. My mother asked Marcus within the first 10 minutes where he had gone to college. When he said he had gone to trade school instead, she set her fork down with a quiet precision that I had learned to fear since childhood. My father asked no questions at all. He spent the entire dinner speaking exclusively to me about topics that had nothing to do with Marcus, as if Marcus were a piece of furniture that had been placed at the table by mistake. On the drive home, Marcus held my hand and didn't say anything negative. He just said, "I know that was hard. Thank you for trying." I cried in the car. He didn't try to fix it. He just kept holding my hand. 3 weeks later, I found out I was pregnant. I sat with it alone for 5 days before I told Marcus. He went quiet for a long moment, then asked me what I wanted. Not what he thought I should do, not what made sense logistically, what I wanted. I told him I wanted to keep the baby. He nodded slowly and said, "Then we figure it out together." He called his mother that same night. I heard him pacing in the kitchen talking to her in a low voice, and when he came back he said, "She cried, the good kind." I told my parents on a Sunday afternoon. My mother's face went through several expressions too quickly to name. My father said nothing for almost a full minute. Then he asked, very calmly, who the father was. When I told him, something shifted in his expression, not surprise, because he had clearly already constructed the possibility, but something more like a decision being finalized. He told me that if I chose to continue the pregnancy with this man, I could not continue to expect their support, financial, emotional, or otherwise. I told him I wasn't asking for his permission. I was informing him of a decision I had already made. He told me to think very carefully before I walked out of that house. I picked up my purse and walked out. Marcus and I were married 4 months later at the Brazoria County Courthouse. His mother stood on his side. My best friend from college stood on mine. There were 12 people total, including the officiant. No one from my family came. My mother sent a card with no return address. My father sent nothing. I wore a white sundress I had bought for $38 at a consignment store. And Marcus cried when he saw me walk in, and I have never in my life felt more like I was in exactly the right place. We moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Pearland. Marcus was working 60-hour weeks. I finished my degree online while I was pregnant, juggling coursework and a part-time job at a marketing firm that let me work remotely. Our son Daniel was born on a Tuesday in March. He weighed 7 pounds, 4 ounces. He had Marcus's jawline and, apparently, my tendency to be furious about things for exactly 30 seconds and then completely move on. He was the easiest baby we could have asked for, which we decided was either luck or karma coming around early. The first years were tight. There were months where we made grocery decisions based on what was on sale and planned every expense 2 weeks out. Marcus started taking side jobs on weekends. Custom metalwork, fabrication contracts for small businesses, railings and gates, and specialty installations. He was extraordinarily good at it. His reputation spread the way good work always does, quietly and through people who trusted each other. By the time Daniel was 4, Marcus had enough clients to register the business officially. Web Fabrication and Metalworks, LLC. I designed the logo on a free graphic design platform at 11 o'clock at night after Daniel went to sleep. I want to be honest about those years. They were hard in ways I had not fully anticipated. There were nights when I lay awake calculating numbers that didn't add up and wondering if I had been reckless. There were moments when I felt the absence of my parents. Not as a wound exactly, but as a strange hollow weight. The knowledge that something that should have been there simply wasn't. Marcus never pretended those feelings weren't real. He also never let me live inside them for too long. He had a way of redirecting without minimizing, of saying, "I know," and meaning it fully, and then gently pointing towards something worth looking at. Daniel grew up watching his father build things. He used to sit on the turned-over bucket in the workshop from the time he could walk, watching Marcus work, asking questions Marcus answered without talking down to him. By the time Daniel was 8, he could name every tool in the shop. By 12, he was helping on small projects. Marcus never pushed him toward it. He always said Daniel would figure out his own path. But the kid was genuinely fascinated by how things were made and how structures held together under pressure. He started saying in middle school that he wanted to be a structural engineer. Marcus and I tried not to make too big a deal of it, but we were privately insufferable about it for weeks. I had built a real career by then. The marketing firm had promoted me twice in 5 years, and I had eventually moved to a larger company managing communications for a mid-sized energy company. We bought a house in 2019, a 4-bedroom with a workshop space in the back that Marcus immediately claimed. I planted a garden in the side yard that I was mediocre at maintaining but deeply attached to. We had 2 dogs, a standing Friday night movie tradition with Daniel, and a life that felt, I want to use the right word here, solid. Not perfect, not without difficulty, solid. The way something feels when it has been built carefully over time by people who meant it. My parents had become, in my mind, a chapter from a different book. I thought about them occasionally. The way you think about a version of yourself you no longer recognize. I had heard through distant mutual connections that my father's firm had gone through some restructuring in recent years. I had heard that my mother's health had not been great. I did not reach out. They knew where I was. They had always known where I was. Daniel was in his junior year at Texas A&M, mechanical engineering, when everything shifted. It was a Wednesday evening in October. I was making dinner and Marcus was in the workshop finishing a commercial railing installation that had to be delivered Friday. My phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Houston area code, but nothing in my contacts. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer. It was my mother. She sounded older, not just in the way that 22 years will age a voice, but in a particular way. Careful and effortful. Like each sentence required preparation. She said my name once, and then she said she was sorry to call out of nowhere. And then she said she needed to talk to me. I stood in my kitchen with the stove still on and said nothing for several seconds. She told me my father had been forced to resign from the firm 2 years earlier. I had not heard this. She said there had been an ethics investigation, billing irregularities, conflicts of interest in several cases. Allegations that had taken 3 years and a great deal of money to resolve without criminal charges. The name above the entrance had been quietly removed. The firm had been renamed. His reputation, the one he had spent his entire adult life constructing and protecting, was effectively gone. I sat down on one of the kitchen chairs. She kept talking. She told me they had spent most of their savings on legal defense, that they had sold the house in River Oaks, that my father had been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease the previous spring, and that his medications were expensive in ways that their current finances made difficult to sustain. And then she said the part she had been building toward the entire time. She said they were struggling. She said she didn't know who else to call. She said she was reaching out because I was her daughter, and she hoped that meant something. I asked her one question. I asked if she had called because she wanted a relationship with me, or because she needed help. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, both. I told her I needed time to think. She said she understood. I hung up the phone and sat at the kitchen table until I heard Marcus's boots on the back steps. And when he came in and saw my face, he washed his hands and sat down across from me without saying anything, and waited. I told him everything. He listened the whole way through. Then he asked me the same question he had asked 22 years earlier in a different context. What did I want? I told him I didn't know yet. He said that was a completely fair answer. I spent 2 weeks sitting with it. I talked to my closest friend, a woman I had known since college who had watched my parents' rejection from the beginning and had strong feelings she shared carefully. I talked to Daniel, which was the conversation I had been most uncertain about. He was 21 years old, a junior in college, and he had grown up knowing his maternal grandparents existed and had never met him. I had never spoken badly about them to him. I had told him when he was old enough to understand that we had disagreed about very important things and had lost touch, and that it made me sad, but that our family was whole and loved, and that was what mattered. He had accepted that with a maturity that still surprised me. When I told him about the phone call, he was quiet in the way Marcus was quiet, processing rather than withdrawing. Then he asked what they wanted. I explained the situation. He asked if I was going to see them. I told him I hadn't decided. He nodded slowly and said, "Whatever you decide, I'm not going to be weird about it. But I want you to decide based on what's right for you, not based on feeling guilty." He was 21 years old and he said that to me, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. I had to excuse myself to get a glass of water I didn't need. I arranged to meet my mother at a coffee shop. Not at my home. That felt like too much too soon. I told Marcus where I was going. He hugged me at the door and said he'd have dinner ready when I got back. She looked smaller than I remembered. I don't mean that unkindly. She had been a tall, composed, formidable woman for all of my childhood, and she still held herself with a certain practiced dignity. But the scale of her had changed. She stood up when she saw me come in, and I could see her deciding in real time whether to reach for me. I let her hug me briefly. We sat down. She talked for a long time. About how the years had gone. About my father's health. The logistics of managing it. The financial reality they were facing. She talked around the core of it for a while. The way people do when they have rehearsed the practical details to avoid sitting too long in the emotional ones. I finally interrupted her. Not unkindly, and said, "I need to hear you say what you actually want to say, not the situation. The thing underneath it." She looked at her coffee cup. Then she looked at me. And she said, "I think we were wrong. About Marcus. About how we handled it. About all of it. I have thought about it for years, and I have not known what to do with that. And then things got very hard and I thought maybe it wasn't too late." I asked her why she hadn't called before things got hard. She didn't have a good answer for that. She said she thought she was protecting her pride. She said she had told herself so many times that we would reconcile eventually, that there was time, and then time kept passing, and it became easier not to think about it than to confront it. I told her I had a son she had never met, that he was 21 years old, and brilliant and kind, and that he had built his own sense of family out of the materials available to him, and that he was whole and happy without them, and that I needed her to understand that before anything else. I needed her to understand that we had not been waiting. We had been living, she cried. I didn't. I had done my crying about this in other rooms in other years. I told her that I was not going to make a decision in this coffee shop. I told her that if there was going to be any kind of relationship going forward, it would be on different terms than anything she had ever offered me. That Marcus would not be treated as anything other than my equal partner, that Daniel would have the choice about whether he wanted to know them at all, and that I would not be managed or pressured about any of it. She said she understood. She said she would accept whatever terms I set. I told her I would be in touch. I drove home and sat in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside. Marcus had made chicken and roasted vegetables. Daniel had texted to ask how it went. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the two dogs sleeping on their bed by the back door, and at Marcus's jacket hanging on the hook by the mudroom, and at the school photo of Daniel at age 7 that we still had on the refrigerator even though he was in college. And I felt, not angry, not sad exactly, but very clearly oriented. Like I knew which direction was north. I eventually agreed to limited contact. My father and I spoke on the phone twice in the following months. The conversations were short and careful, full of long pauses that neither of us rushed to fill. He was not the same man who had told me to think carefully before walking out of his house. The illness had done something to the architecture of him. Had removed certain load-bearing walls, I suppose. He told me once, unprompted, that Marcus sounded like a good man. I said that he was. My father said he was glad. That was the closest thing to an apology I received from him. I decided after sitting with it for a while that it was enough. Not because it was sufficient in some objective sense, but because I was no longer waiting for something from him. I had stopped waiting a long time ago. What I had now was just contact. A thread, not a rope. And that felt like the right weight for what we actually had. Daniel met them once, at the end of that first year, at a lunch that lasted about an hour and a half. He was polite in the way that Marcus had raised him to be. Genuine without performing. Engaged without performing. Honest without performing. He shook my father's hand and asked him about his career in law with what I recognized as genuine curiosity and no trace of bitterness. My mother kept looking at him like she was trying to do math. She had let herself forget. On the drive home, Daniel was quiet for a few miles and then he said, "I can see why you left." I asked what he meant. He said, "I can see what kind of house you grew up in, and I can see what kind of house you built instead." He looked out the window. "Ours is better." I had to pull over for a minute because I couldn't see the road. Marcus had known, somehow, not to be there for that lunch. He had a job that day, which may or may not have been completely unavoidable. He had not said one negative word about my parents across 22 years of marriage. Not once. He had answered Daniel's questions about them honestly and without editorializing, had never made me feel guilty for my grief about them, and had never asked me to choose between working through it and letting it go. When I got home that evening and told him what Daniel had said, Marcus was quiet for a moment, and then he smiled. Not a big smile. Just the kind that starts in the eyes, and said, "That kid." The fabrication business had grown into something none of us had fully predicted. Marcus had 6 full-time employees now, and a client list that included 2 major commercial contractors in the Houston area. He had been asked twice to speak at trade association events about building a small fabrication business from scratch. He always said yes, because he remembered being 23 with a certification and a truck, and wanting very badly to hear from someone who had figured it out. I had been promoted to VP of Communications the previous year. I managed a team of 11 people and had recently been asked to lead a complete rebrand initiative for the company. I worked from home on Fridays. I still had the garden, which I was still mediocre at, but had made incremental peace with. I'm not telling you all of this to catalog our accomplishments. I'm telling you because I want you to understand what 22 years of choosing each other actually looks like when you add it all up. It looks like a workshop in the backyard, and a logo designed at 11 p.m., and a kid who turned out better than you had any right to expect. And Friday night movies and dinner waiting when you come home from hard conversations. It looks like a life that was never glamorous but was always, without question, real. My father passed away in the spring of last year. It was not unexpected. The Parkinson's had progressed, and the last several months had been difficult. I flew to Houston and sat with my mother for 3 days. Marcus came the second day. He shook my mother's hand and helped carry things and fixed a broken latch on the back gate without being asked. And my mother watched him with an expression I couldn't quite read, but that looked something like reckoning. At the funeral, my father's former colleagues spoke about his legal mind, his precision, his decades of contribution to the firm. Nobody mentioned the ethics investigation. Nobody mentioned the resignation. That is the privilege of memory. You can curate even at the end. I sat in the front row and thought about the man who had told me that a name carved in granite meant something, and about how the granite had been quietly recarved while he was still alive, and about how none of that had anything to do with whether Daniel grew up loved. My mother is doing better than I expected her to. She has moved into a smaller house, manages well enough, and calls me on Sunday evenings. We are not close in the way I might have wished when I was young. We are in contact, consistently and with some genuine warmth, and she has told me 3 or 4 times that she wishes things had been different. I believe her. I also know that believing her doesn't require me to rewrite what happened. Both things can be true. Daniel graduates in the spring. He has already been recruited by a structural engineering firm in Austin. They approached him before he had even finished his final year. He called to tell us on a Tuesday night, and Marcus and I stood in the kitchen and did an embarrassingly enthusiastic celebration that Daniel pretended to find mortifying. He will be extraordinary at this. He has his father's patience with materials and his own very particular intelligence about how things hold up under stress. He has watched, his entire life, what it looks like when something is built right. People ask me sometimes whether I regret any of it. The lost years with my parents, the hard early years. The wedding with 12 people in a courthouse instead of whatever my mother had imagined. I think they expect some complicated answer. Some acknowledgement that it would have been easier with family support. Some qualified version of yes. What I actually feel is something simpler. I think about Marcus in that Whataburger parking lot, talking for 4 hours without pretense. I think about him asking me what I wanted when everything was uncertain. I think about him washing his hands and sitting down across from me at the kitchen table without making me explain why I needed a minute. I think about all the ordinary Tuesdays and Fridays and mornings when nothing happened except that we were there, showing up for each other without drama or condition. They told me I was throwing everything away. I was building something they didn't have a blueprint for. That's all.